The wind had worried the high country for 3 straight days. It came down from the northern peaks, sharp with old snow, crossed miles of empty grass, and struck the hills hard enough to bend the pines. Dust lifted from the wagon road in pale sheets. Fence wire hummed. The cattle stood with their backs to the weather, and their heads lowered, waiting for the land to stop trying to drive them from it. Silas Reed did not wait for anything. Before daylight, he carried grain to the barn, broke ice from the water trough, and checked every stretch of fence along the eastern ridge. He worked without haste and without rest. His coat was patched at both elbows. His boots had been resoled so many times that no 2 pieces of leather matched. The crown of his hat had faded nearly gray. From the road, his place looked poor. The house was small and weathered, built beneath a low hill that hid the western sky. The barn leaned slightly into the wind. There were no painted gates, no carved sign, and no wide porch, like the prosperous ranches closer to town. Silas kept only 6 horses near the house, and a few dozen cattle in the visible pasture. People in Dry Creek assumed that was all he had. Silas never corrected them. He had learned long ago that a man could lose less if the world believed he possessed nothing worth taking. His days followed one another with little change. Coffee before dawn, work until dark, supper beside the stove, a single lamp burning at the kitchen table while he mended tack or sharpened tools. There had once been another cup on the shelf. He kept it turned backward now. He had lived alone for 7 years. On the 4th morning of the windstorm, Silas rode into Dry Creek for lamp oil, flour, and a new hinge for the barn door. He tied his horse outside Harlan's Mercantile and stepped into the warmth. The store smelled of coffee beans, wool coats, and damp leather. 3 men stood around the stove talking cattle prices. Mrs. Harlan was stacking canned peaches behind the counter. Near the front window stood a woman with one hand resting on a worn brown valise. She looked to be near 30. Her dark hair was pinned neatly beneath a plain blue bonnet, though the wind had pulled loose several strands. Her dress was clean, but traveled in. Mud had dried along the hem. She held a folded sheet of paper. Mrs. Harlan looked up when Silas entered. "There he is," she said. Silas stopped. The woman by the window turned toward him. Her face was tired, but not weak. Her eyes studied him with the careful attention of someone who had already trusted the wrong people once. Mrs. Harlan wiped her hands on her apron. "Miss Clara Bell answered your notice." Silas glanced at the paper in the woman's hand. 3 months earlier, he had placed an advertisement for a housekeeper and cook. The winter had left him with a fever that kept him in bed for 8 days. Afterward, the doctor told him plainly that pride was not much use to a dead man. Silas had expected an older widow from a neighboring county. He had not expected Clara Bell. "You're Mr. Reed?" she asked. "I am." She looked past him through the window at his horse, then back at his patched coat. "I was told you owned a ranch." "I do." One of the men by the stove coughed into his fist to hide a smile. Clara noticed. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her valise. "I can cook, sew, keep accounts, and tend a garden," she said. "I do not require much. A room, meals, and the wages stated in the notice." Silas nodded. "You understand it's 12 miles out? I came farther than 12 miles. Her voice was quiet, but there was iron in it. Silas took the valise before she could object. Wagons around back. The ride from town took nearly 2 hours. Clara sat beside him beneath a wool blanket while the wagon creaked through the wind. She asked no questions for the first 6 miles. Silas offered no conversation. The road climbed into open country, where sagebrush clung to the hills and distant mountains disappeared behind low clouds. At last Clara spoke. "Mrs. Harlan said you lived alone." "I do." "Is there family nearby?" "No." "Neighbors?" "Not close." The wagon struck a rut. Clara caught the seat with one hand. Silas slowed the horses. "You're free to return to town if the place doesn't suit you," he said. "I spent my last money on the stagecoach." He looked at her. She faced the road. My father died in Missouri last spring, she continued. The farm was mortgaged. My brother took what remained and went east. There was no place for me there. Silas turned his eyes back to the horses. You'll be paid every Saturday. I intend to earn it. When the house came into view, Clara leaned forward slightly. The small structure crouched beneath the hill, its shingles dark with age. A thin stream of smoke rose from the chimney. Beyond it stood the leaning barn and the narrow pasture, with Silas's few cattle. Clara said nothing, but Silas saw the disappointment settle in her face. Not disgust, not anger, only the look of someone discovering that the final door left open to her led into another narrow room. He carried her valise inside. The house was cleaner than she had expected, though spare. The kitchen held a broad iron stove, a scarred table, and shelves lined with jars. A faded braided rug lay before the hearth. Silas showed her a small bedroom at the end of the hall. It gets cold at night, he said. There are quilts in the chest. Clara set her bonnet on the bed. When do you take supper? After chores. What time? When they're done. She looked at him. That is not a time. Silas almost smiled. Near 7. That first evening, Clara made stew from potatoes, onions, and a piece of salt pork she found in the pantry. Silas ate 2 bowls. It needs time, she said. I don't have time. I noticed. The next morning, Silas woke to the smell of bread. He entered the kitchen to find Clara kneading dough with her sleeves rolled above her wrists. Flour dusted the table and one side of her cheek. You don't have to start before daylight, he said. You do. That's different. I'm being paid. He poured coffee. The bread was ready when he returned from the barn. She had placed 2 slices beside his plate. There was butter on one and nothing on the other. Silas took the plain slice. The next morning, both slices were buttered. Neither of them mentioned it. The wind eased by the end of the week. Clara began setting the house in order. She washed curtains that had gone stiff with dust. She sorted the pantry and wrote a list of what was needed in a firm, tidy hand. She found 3 cracked jars, a sack of spoiled beans, and enough mouse droppings to make her stand in the kitchen with her hands on her hips. Silas entered carrying firewood. You have traps? She asked. In the barn. How many? 6. Bring all of them. He did. On Saturday, he placed her wages beside her plate in a small envelope. Clara counted the coins once. This is $2 extra. For supplies. Supplies for the house are your expense. Then call it advance pay. I did not ask for an advance. Silas met her eyes. After a moment, he took back the $2. The following week, he returned from town with thyme, cinnamon, and a bolt of blue cloth. Clara held up the cloth. What is this? Curtains. We have curtains. They're thin. They were thin when I arrived. Silas hung his hat on the peg. Storekeeper said blue cloth was on sale. Clara examined the fine weave. It had not been on sale. She made new curtains and said nothing. As March softened into April, the ground began to thaw. Water trickled beneath the last shelves of ice. Meadowlarks returned to the fence posts. Clara planted a garden beside the house. Silas told her the soil there was too stony. She carried stones away 1 bucket at a time. On the 3rd day, he appeared with a plow horse. He guided the animal across the patch, while Clara walked behind, breaking clods with a hoe. By evening, the garden had doubled in size. They planted potatoes, beans, onions, squash, and carrots. Clara pressed each seed into the earth with careful fingers. Silas repaired the fence around the garden to keep out rabbits. A week later, Clara found a rabbit inside it. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Silas close a gap beneath the lowest rail. You said the fence was finished. It was. The rabbit disagreed. Silas looked toward the animal chewing one of her first green shoots. I'll speak to him. Clara laughed. The sound was small and sudden. Silas remained crouched beside the fence, one hand on the rail. It had been a long time since laughter had reached that part of the house. In May, Clara began riding the older mare named Juniper into the lower pasture to bring Silas his midday meal. At first, she carried the food in a tin pail and left as soon as he took it. Later, she stayed beneath the cottonwood while he ate. They spoke little. Silas would sit with his back against the trunk, boots crossed at the ankles. Clara would gather wildflowers or read one of the 3 books she had brought in her valise. Sometimes the wind turned the pages for her. When that happened, Silas placed a smooth stone on the corner of the book. By June, he brought the stone before she arrived. She kept it in her pocket. The visible herd grew as calves were born in the lower pasture. Clara learned each animal's markings. She named one crooked-legged calf Button, though Silas told her cattle did not need names. When Button became sick, Silas stayed in the barn through the night. Clara found him there at dawn, sitting against the stall with the calf's head across his thigh. She handed him coffee. Will he live? Maybe. She sat beside him. Button lived. Silas never used the name, but when he added the calf to his ledger, Clara saw the word written in the margin. July came hot and dry. Dust settled over the house each afternoon. The hills turned gold. Clara hung wet sheets across the windows to cool the kitchen. Silas spent long days away from the house, riding north. Clara noticed that he always disappeared behind the hill west of the barn. He returned at sundown with dust on his shoulders and burrs caught in his horse's tail. Sometimes he carried a broken bridle or a roll of wire. Once, she heard the distant bawling of cattle from beyond the ridge. She asked him about it over supper. More pasture back there? She said. Some. How much? Enough. She waited. Silas continued eating. Clara had learned that questions struck him like thrown stones. He did not become angry. He simply moved farther away. So she stopped asking. In August, one of the barn beams split during a storm. Silas climbed a ladder in the rain and tried to brace it alone. Clara stood below with a lantern. You need another man, she called. I need the rope. You need sense. The rope, Clara. She handed it to him. The ladder shifted beneath his boot. Clara caught the side and held it steady until he finished. By the time he climbed down, both were soaked. You could have fallen, she said. I didn't. That is not the same as being careful. Silas pulled off his wet gloves. No. It was the first time he had agreed with her without resistance. The next morning, he hired 2 brothers from town to replace the beam. Clara watched them work from the kitchen window. In September, she mended Silas's winter coat. She found the lining torn and one pocket nearly loose. Inside the pocket was a small wooden horse, worn smooth with age. When Silas returned, the horse stood on the kitchen table. He stopped in the doorway. I found it while sewing, Clara said. Silas picked it up. His thumb passed over the tiny carved mane. My son made that. Clara remained still. Silas had never spoken of a son. He was 9, he said. His mother taught him to carve. The kitchen clock ticked. What happened? Clara asked. Fever. He placed the horse in his pocket. Both of them? Silas nodded. Then he carried the mended coat to his room and closed the door. The next morning, Clara set his coffee beside his plate. There were 2 slices of buttered bread. Nothing more. By October, the evenings turned cold. Clara moved her chair closer to the stove. Silas began reading aloud from the newspaper after supper. Not because either of them cared much about distant politics, but because the sound filled the room. He read slowly. Clara sewed. When he mispronounced a French name, she corrected him. Silas repeated it the same wrong way. She looked up. He stared at the newspaper with a perfectly solemn face. You are doing that on purpose. Wouldn't know how. The corner of her mouth lifted. Their life settled into a shape neither had planned. Then a black carriage arrived from Dry Creek. It came on a Wednesday afternoon, polished wheels throwing dust across the yard. A heavy-set man stepped down in a dark coat and brushed the road from his sleeves. Clara saw him through the kitchen window. The color left her face. Silas was repairing a gate near the barn. He straightened as the stranger approached. "Silas Reed?" the man called. "That's me. My name is Amos Crowell. I represent Bell and Crowell Holdings." Clara came onto the porch. Crowell smiled at her without kindness. "There you are." Silas moved between them. "You know him?" he asked. Clara's hands closed around the porch rail. "He was my father's business partner." Crowell removed a folded document from his coat. "Miss Bell left Missouri before certain accounts were settled. My father's debts were paid with the farm. Not all of them." Crowell held out the paper. Silas did not take it. "What do you want?" Crowell looked around at the house, barn, and dry pasture. "Not much here, is there?" His gaze returned to Clara. "Miss Bell signed as witness on several notes. Her brother has vanished. That leaves her as the only Bell I can find." "A witness is not a debtor," Clara said. Crowell smiled. "That will be for a judge to decide." He told them he intended to petition the county court for Clara's wages until the debt was satisfied. If she refused to appear, he would request a warrant. Clara stood very still. Silas asked, "How much?" Crowell named a sum large enough to consume 5 years of her wages. Silas's face did not change. "You'll leave now," he said. Crowell glanced toward the worn barn. "You cannot hide her out here forever." "I'm not hiding." Clara's voice was firmer than her hands. Crowell touched the brim of his hat and returned to his carriage. That evening, Clara packed her valise. Silas found it beside the front door. "You're leaving? I will not have him take your wages or drag your name through court. My name has survived worse. You do not know him." "No. He took my father's trust first, then the farm. My brother said we could fight him, but he left before the papers were filed." Silas looked at the valise. "Where will you go?" "Somewhere he will not find me. He found you here." Her eyes filled, though no tears fell. "I thought this place was too small to interest him." Silas glanced around the kitchen. The blue curtains moved gently in the evening air. Jars from Clara's garden lined the shelves. Her sewing rested beside the stove. "You thought I owned nothing," he said. Clara looked down. "I thought you had enough trouble without mine." Silas lifted the valise and carried it back to her room. She followed him. "I am leaving in the morning." "No, you cannot decide that." "You're right." He set the valise beside the bed. "But before you go, there is something you should see." At sunrise, Silas saddled Juniper and his bay gelding. They rode west, toward the hill. The slope was steeper than it appeared from the house. Pine roots crossed the narrow trail. Frost silvered the grass in shaded places. Clara followed Silas to the crest. When they reached the top, the land opened beneath them. The valley beyond the hill stretched farther than Clara could see. It rolled north between 2 mountain ridges, green even in autumn, where a river curved through the basin. Hundreds of cattle grazed across the meadows. 3 barns stood near the water. Farther west, hired riders moved a herd toward broad winter pastures. Fences climbed the hills in straight lines. Hayfields filled the southern flats. A stand of cottonwoods marked another house, and a stone spring house beside it. Morning light spilled slowly over the whole valley. Clara stared. Silas removed his hat. "My father bought the first section," he said. "I added the rest before the war. 11,000 acres now." She turned toward him. "All of this is yours?" "Yes." "The cattle?" "Most of them." "The men?" "They work for me." Clara looked back at his patched coat and tired saddle. "Why do you live in that little house?" Silas studied the valley. "My wife chose it. Said the hill kept the winter wind off the porch. After she and the boy died, I could not move into the larger place. The truth came without drama. It lay between them like a gate finally opened. I let the town think the ranch had failed," he continued. "It kept men like Crowell from looking too closely. My foreman sells the cattle under another company name." Clara's eyes moved across the herds. "You could pay the debt." "I could." Her expression hardened. "I will not let you buy my freedom." "I wouldn't." "Then why show me this?" Silas met her gaze. Because you were leaving to protect a poor man. The wind moved through the grass around their horses' legs. And? She asked. And I needed you to know. There is enough here to fight him. Clara looked toward the river. What if the court believes his papers? Then we find better papers. And if we cannot? Then we appeal. He will keep coming. So will I. She lowered her eyes. Silas put his hat back on. I am not asking you to stay because I need a cook. Clara's breath caught. He continued, before courage could leave him. The house was quiet before you came. I told myself I preferred it. He looked toward the distant cattle. I was wrong. Clara pressed one hand against the saddle horn. You barely speak to me. I know. You hide half your life behind a hill. I know that too. She gave a broken little laugh. Silas reached across the space between their horses and held out his hand. His palm was rough, marked by rope burns and old scars. I can't promise Crowell won't make trouble, he said. I can promise you won't face him alone. Clara looked at his hand for a long moment. Then she placed hers in it. I do not want your charity. You won't have it. I want the wages we agreed on. Every Saturday. And the garden stays by the small house. Silas closed his fingers gently around hers. The garden stays. They rode to town that afternoon. Silas entered the county office wearing the same patched coat. Clara walked beside him, carrying the notes Crowell had served. The clerk's expression changed when Silas placed the deed to the valley on the desk, followed by ledgers, bank statements, and a letter from an attorney in Denver. Crowell's claim did not disappear in a day, but it weakened under examination. The signatures on 2 notes had been altered. Payments made by Clara's father had never been recorded. Within a month, the county judge dismissed the petition and ordered Crowell's remaining accounts reviewed. By spring, Amos Crowell had left Missouri for parts unknown. Clara never asked where. Winter settled over the ranch. Snow covered the valley beyond the hill and softened the roof of the small house. Silas hired men to rebuild the leaning barn, though Clara insisted one crooked beam remain, because the swallows nested there. On cold evenings, they sat beside the stove. Silas read the newspaper. Clara sewed. The wooden horse stood upright on the shelf between 2 blue jars. One Saturday, Silas placed her wages beside her plate as always. Clara opened the envelope. Inside were the proper coins and a small brass key. She held it up. What is this? Front door. The door has never been locked. Might be someday. She turned the key in her fingers. Silas looked at his coffee. You should have one. Clara rose and crossed to the peg beside the door. She tied the key to a blue ribbon and hung it there. Then she returned to the table. Outside, the wind came down from the peaks and crossed the hidden valley, rattling the windows of the little house beneath the hill. Silas reached across the table. Clara placed her hand in his. Neither spoke. The lamp burned between them, steady and warm, while beyond the hill, the cattle rested under snow, the river moved beneath its skin of ice, and 11,000 acres waited for morning.